Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. Before we begin, can I just say if you enjoy this story, please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this one or stories about the history of the Northeast. And do please feel free to share this video if you think others might enjoy it too. One last thing I need to add, I am currently testing out a new microphone, which I hope is going to make the audio quality a lot better. I am having one or two issues with it, one of those being volume on playback, but please bear with me as I hope to get all the issues resolved very quickly. In 1869, in Newcastle upon Tyne, George Weir was found guilty of stabbing Matilda Martin, often also known as Matilda Rennick, which resulted in her death. A slightly strange story, but one I hope you will find interesting. George was not even 18 years old at the time the murder was committed. This is his story. George was born in around 1853 in Middlesbrough to parents Thomas and Mary. He is one of at least 4 children. There are no indications that he lived in the Newcastle area, but in 1869 he was a fireman on the steamer the Fusilier, which was berthed in Newcastle, and he was in the town with some of his friends. At the time of the crime, it was stated that George was around 20 years old. Some reports even said he was 23, but he was closer to actually being only 17 years old. I have not been able to find any information about Matilda Martin, alias Rennick, the victim, other than the fact that she lived in Newcastle on and off for 15 years with a man named William Rennick. They do not appear to be married, but she had often used his name and was said to be around 23 years old. It was suggested that at the time of the crime, Matilda and William were no longer together as a couple. Newspaper reports from the time of the crime are fairly split down the middle, with the use of both Martin and Rennick as her surname. This has been one of the reasons why I have struggled to find any information about her previous life. There are no indications as to what her job may have been, but she is described as not very nicely, but very well at all in most articles, with some suggestion that she may have been working the streets, but this has actually never been confirmed. On November the 17th, George had been out drinking with 2 male friends. This was possibly 3, but most articles only state 2, and he was in the quayside area of Newcastle. At around midnight, they met Matilda and her friend named Christina and chatted for a while. They then tried to go into a public house in Pandon known as Taylor's Public House, but the landlady refused to let them in. However, she sold them some beer to take away. The group of 3 men and 2 women now headed to the home of Christina, which was also in Pandon, where it was said that they went inside and drank the beer and sang some songs. It was then stated that around 2 a.m. George left the house, quickly followed by Matilda. They had not been outside very long when Matilda was heard to shout, "Murder!" and "Police!" It seems that the cries were initially ignored, as it was stated that this was often something that was heard in the Pandon area, so people often took no notice. However, the 2 men and Christina, who were still in the house, decided to go and look outside and see what was happening. Here they found Matilda lying on the ground on her back, and she had been stabbed in the chest. They immediately sent for the police, and Sergeant Anderson and PC Scott from the nearby Manners police station were quickly at the scene. PC Scott tried to speak to Matilda, and it was stated that when asked who had done this to her, she had replied by saying, "a man" or "my man," but she was having difficulty speaking, so it was not quite clear what she had actually said. Sergeant Anderson had Matilda taken to Manners police station, where she was seen by Dr. Ridley. Dr. Ridley did not feel there was much hope, and Matilda died around 15 minutes later. At the same time that Sergeant Anderson, PC Scott and Dr. Ridley were taking care of Matilda, PC Coxon was on duty in the area of New Road in Newcastle, where a man was heard to be shouting, "Police, I've been robbed." The man was George Weir. P.C. Coxon went with him to Pandon, where he began looking for the woman dressed in black as described to him by George. There was still quite a large crowd of people in the area, and while he was searching, someone spoke to him and said, "That is the man that stabbed the woman," pointing towards George. P.C. Coxon did not know about the stabbing at this time, but he very quickly learnt of the fate of Matilda, and he took George to the police station, where he was later charged with the murder of Matilda. On arriving at the police station, the body of Matilda was seen by George, and he stated that this was the woman that had robbed him. He said she had stolen 23 shillings from him. P.C. Coxon searched George and found a small amount of money and a knife. However, he found no blood on either the knife or the clothing or the body of George Weir. Matilda was also searched, and 21 shillings and sixpence was found in her clothing. It was never questioned as to whether she would have been likely to have this kind of money, or if this was indeed money that she had stolen from George. The inquest was held the next day, where it was stated that Matilda had died due to the loss of blood from the wound to her chest. The coroner said this was a deep wound which went back towards the heart but did not quite reach it. He felt the wound could have easily been caused by a knife. It is at this point that the inquest was adjourned. Information was required as to the whereabouts of William Rennick, the previous or not recent boyfriend of Matilda, and they wanted to know that where he had been at the time of the crime. Due to Sergeant Anderson not being able to understand what Matilda had said as she was dying, and the possibility that she had indeed said, "my man," it was felt that William did need to be questioned. When the inquest resumed, William stated that he had been in his lodging house in Blenheim Street in Newcastle from around 9 o'clock on November the 17th until 7:30 a.m. the following morning, and had not left at any time in between those hours. The lodging house keeper, Margaret Cowan, gave evidence similar to that of William Rennick in regard to the hours he claimed to have been inside the lodging house. She said she had seen the two men. The second man was Richard Rennick, who also gave evidence later. She said she had seen the two men come home and head straight to their room. She said that she herself had gone to bed at around 11 p.m, had not seen either of them leave the house again until the morning. Richard Rennick, the man mentioned previously, who was also William's half-cousin, stated that the pair had been out drinking at the Blue Post in Pilgrim Street and had been there from around 3 p.m. on November the 17th until they left a little before 8 p.m. They were both, according to Richard, quite worse the wear for the drink and headed straight to the lodgings, where they both immediately went to bed. He also stated that they were at the time sharing the same bed, and that he woke up once or twice and William was there each time. And he said that William did not leave until 7:30 a.m. the next morning. It was also stated that two other men shared the room with them, but these two men did not give evidence. And Richard also stated that he had never heard William say anything bad about Matilda, and he did not know why the couple had separated. The question of guilt with regard to George Weir did not seem to come up at the inquest. He was not questioned, and it would seem that the jury were clearly unable to decide who had committed the crime, and returned an open verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. However, 4 new witnesses came forward after the inquest, and George Weir was then charged again with the murder of Matilda Martin, alias Rennick, and he appeared at the Newcastle Police Court some short time later before Mr. R.B. Sanderson and Mr. B. Plummer, when the witnesses' evidence was given. Mr. Sanderson stated that due to the evidence, the only course of action was to commit George for trial on the charge of murder. The trial took place on December the 22nd, 1869. George Weir pleaded not guilty to the charge. The details of the death of Matilda were given, as I have already mentioned, and the new witnesses were then called to give their evidence. Mary Ellison, who lived in Pandon in the house next door to Christina, Christina being the woman who had been with Matilda the night the crime took place, said that on the night of the crime she heard a woman shout, "I am stabbed." She then claimed to hear two people running away. She had then left her home and gone outside where crowds of people had gathered. She claimed to have spoken to George Weir and told him that his friends had gone back to the Fusilier ship, and it seems that although she came forward with her evidence, she did not actually see who had ran away from the scene. James Hall, also living in Pandon, claimed to have been amongst the crowd outside after the stabbing, and that he had also spoken to George and asked if he was one of the sailors from the Fusilier, and when he said that he was, he then asked him why he had stabbed the woman. He did not say that George had replied to this, but he claimed he told P.C. Coxon that this was the man who had done the deed. Michael Garrity, also living in Pandon, claimed to have heard Matilda shouting that she had been stabbed. On going outside, he claimed to have heard George saying that he was drunk and had been robbed. He was certain that George was the man who had stabbed Matilda, but he had not actually seen it take place. Margaret Moran, another woman who lived in Pandon, claimed to have shouted from her window that George was the man who had stabbed the woman. She shouted, "Did he have a moustache? Because if he did, he was the man." When she was cross-examined about this, she said that Michael Garrity had told her that George looked like the man who had stabbed Matilda. The surgeon, Mr. Rayner, said it was not necessary for either the knife or the prisoner to have any blood on them from the crime, and that the knife found on the prisoner on his arrest could have been the one used to cause the wounds found on Matilda. Mr. Blackwell, acting for the defence, said that the four witnesses did not seem to be able to prove anything. He felt that they were only discussing things that they had heard or been told and not things they had seen with their own eyes. He also felt that it was possible someone known to Matilda had taken revenge when she had refused to hand over the money she had stolen from George. After all, Mary Ellison had claimed to hear two people running from the scene, and if one was George, the other could not have been Matilda, as she was already mortally wounded and unable to move, let alone run, so who was the other person? He also felt that the surgeon's evidence that there may not be blood on the knife or the person who had stabbed Matilda was ridiculous. Such a wound as to cause the victim to bleed to death would surely leave a trace of some kind on the person who committed the crime and the weapon used. His final statement was to remind the jury that there had been little or nothing new added since the inquest, and that they should consider carefully the fact that the jury at the inquest had only been able to agree upon an open verdict. The jury retired for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and on their return they gave the verdict of guilty of manslaughter, with a strong recommendation to mercy because of George's young age. The judge said that it had been a brutal crime, and had it not been for the jury's recommendation, he would have passed a very heavy sentence. He then sentenced George to 10 years in prison. So what do you think? Was George really the guilty party? The evidence that he was does not seem to be 100% clear, other than him definitely being in the area at the time. And would he really want to draw attention to himself by saying he had been robbed? And we only have the word of William Rennick's cousin to say that he had not left his lodgings on the night that Matilda had died, or from the landlady, who herself had been in bed since 11 p.m. Could they have really been sure that William never left while they were asleep? Or could it have been, as the defence thought, someone else who knew Matilda and wanted a share of what she had stolen, the second person who was heard running from the scene? Or was it indeed George, in a moment of rage and madness at being robbed by Matilda and not realising how seriously hurt she was, still looked for a policeman to say he was robbed because he was drunk and not thinking straight? Let me know what you think in the comments. As for the fate of George Weir, it seems that he served his 10 years in prison in Gillingham in Kent, and on his release he returned to his family home in Middlesbrough, and this is where he could be found in 1881. By 1901 he was still in Middlesbrough and was now married with a family of his own. He died in 1909 at the age of 57. I hope you have found this sad and tragic story interesting. If you have enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already done so, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. And please do let me know about the audio. Is it better now? Can you hear it well? Etc. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.